Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the final panel for the fall semester story seminar for natives and nativists in American City. Professors Martin Green, Tim Raphael, and I would like to thank the Mellon Foundation for its generous grant which funded the seminar, Belinda Edmondson, Cornell Chang, and Sean Mitchell for their vision in writing this winning grant and for leading us in these important discussions. We'd like to thank Bertie Lombardi, Mi Hun Yun, and Christina Strasburger, the entire Sawyer team, for their tireless work organizing a semester-long series of panels and events. Lastly, we'd like to thank Chancellor Nancy Cantor and SASN Dean Jackie Mattis for their important support and dedication to the themes of the seminar. As the final Sawyer seminar of the semester, today's theme is migration, displacement, and the arts. Today's panelists take up this theme with a common focus on music. It's a particularly good time to talk about music and migration in Newark. Our city has long been fertile ground for the proliferation of diverse musical scenes, from African-American gospel, jazz, blues, bebop, and hip-hop, Brazilian samba, pagode, axé, and funky, Caribbean salsa, reggaeton, and bomba plena, Ecuadorian pasillo and rumba, Portuguese fado, fandango, and despejada, just to name a few. And the vast majority of the song forms I listed there are available semi-regularly within walking distance of this room. It is also a good moment to talk about music institutionally. Rutgers-Newark, host to the longtime jewel in the campus crown, the Jazz Archives of Dana Library, has recently expanded its focus on sound cultures, creating new performance venues such as Clem's Place and Express Newark, digitizing the Jazz Studies Oral History Collection, developing the Newark Rhythms and Lab and Grid projects, creating a sound studies cluster of excellence, linking various undergraduate and graduate programs through a focus on sound, space, and society. And of course, Newark's longtime anchor arts institutions, NJPAC, the Newark Museum, and the newly revitalized Newark Symphony Hall also continue to grow and expand, doubling down on their mission to connect and serve disparate urban communities through meaningful arts programming and community outreach. And let's not forget one of Newark's flagship corporate enterprises, Audible, the company dedicated to turning the written word into sound, who also greases the wheels of various Newark arts projects, great and small. What is it about music that seems so intensely tied to communities in the midst of change? Change is brought by displacement, by conflict, by migration. Is the list of Newark musical genres mentioned above so long because Newark has been a city profoundly marked by successive waves of displacement and migration? Specifically, the Great Migration of African Americans moving from the South to the North, the Europeans who arrived throughout the 19th century, the post-1965 migration of people from Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the displacement of Newark denizens throughout the 20th century due to so-called urban renewal projects, gentrification, and the uprisings of the civil rights era. What role does music play in these different moments of displacement and flux? It is no coincidence that Paul Gilroy focused on music to hash out his theory of the Black Atlantic, the expressive medium used to understand the important imprint and contribution of the African diaspora on Europe, the Caribbean, and the Americas. Ethnomusicologists who study music among displaced people argue that music is key to identity building projects among the newly arrived, to mitigate the struggle against invisibility and a dearth of social safety nets. Sound cultures affirm identity and promise rescue from the perilous territory of non-belonging, to use the words of Edward Said. Music making is a profoundly social act and can build communities and fortify ties among strangers and kin. As Rutgers-Newark Jazz Studies professor Stefan Harris argues, music can teach people to listen to and understand one another due to its unique capacity to encourage empathy. Practices of quote-unquote deep listening, according to scholars of war zones, can offer a pathway towards tolerance. In Newark, where post-colonial populations on both sides of the North-South divide live side by side on the same streets in the same neighborhoods, having arrived together at this migratory third space, and where the not-so-distant history of the 1967 uprisings mark living memory. What kind of promise does music making hold for the important dialogues of the future still in the making? And I'm sure our panelists are going to engage these questions and many more. And to introduce them and turn the mic over to my co-organizer, Maite Mercado.
So much for those really wonderful words. And thank you all for being here today. And I also want to thank our panelists who agreed to join us today in this really interesting conversation. The way that we will do this will be, I will introduce each of the speakers. Everyone will have a chance to speak, and then at the end, we will open up for discussion. And it is my real pleasure to welcome today and introduce Professor Yona Stamatis. She is an associate professor of ethnomusicology and the director of the music program at University of Illinois Springfield. Her research interests include music and social justice and music and diaspora studies, with a special attention to Greek popular song. Forthcoming publications include a book chapter on gendered representations of song of the Greek woman warrior Bouboulina, and an autoethnographic essay about music and political socialization in early adolescence. Her research has been supported by the Fulbright Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, and the Constantin Sangadas Fellowship for Hellenic Studies at the University of Michigan. Her book project centers on the socio-political functions of Rebetiko performance in Greece during the recent economic crisis. She is founder and editor of the new music section of the diaspora journal Heirloom, Greek American Arts and Letters, and please join me in welcoming. Right, so thank you so much for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here amongst friends and colleagues interested in the very same topics that are so interesting to me. So thank you so much for the invitation. I'm also particularly excited to speak to you today. This is a very new project on which I'm embarking, and your constructive feedback is really, really welcome. So the title of my talk today, Negros Moria, Sounding Post-Migrant Belonging in Contemporary Greece. Imagine yourself in the audience at a concert in Athens, Greece, featuring up-and-coming hip-hop artist Negros Moria. The concert begins in blackness. Over the loudspeakers flow the strains of a well-known Rebetiko song composed in 1935. By the most famous Rebetiko musician of all time, Marcos Vázquez. Last night in the dark,
two black men cornered me to search me and to take my black away. When the song finishes, Negros de Moria appears on stage and greets his audience. Kalispera, y molefkos filosas Negros de Moria. Good evening, I'm your white friend, Negros de Moria. Those familiar with Negros know of his talent for incorporating elements of traditional Greek culture and history into hip-hop to make powerful statements about the intersections of race, citizenship, and national identity in Greece. In this paper, I suggest that Negros is engaging in something quite radical, what I call post-migrant counternationalism, the reworking of elements of traditional Greek culture and history to form an alternative nationalist discourse that places the post-migrant at the center of Greek national identity constructs. What makes Negros' work so interesting is that while it counters dominant organic models of national belonging, it does not advocate for transnationalism or alternative modes of social cohesion, or even for the elimination of national borders. Instead, its central preoccupation is with countering prejudice and discrimination against Negros and other post-migrants by proving his own Greekness as more authentic and valid than that of many ethnic Greeks. So my paper today is divided into three sections. First, I will discuss questions of Greek national identity and migrant belonging. Then I will present post-migrant counternationalism as a theoretical framework for understanding Negros de Moria's complex and even contradictory activist approach to musical composition and performance. And then finally, I will analyze very briefly two of his songs, his most recent single, Tohum Kapsi, and his song Ascrimero from his 2016 album. So we begin with the problems of Greek national identity and migrant belonging. Greece has long been characterized as a geographical and cultural crossroads. Positioned on the southern end of the Balkan Peninsula, Greece is part of Southeastern Europe, Mediterranean, the EU, the EEC, the Balkans. Its 15,000 kilometers of coastline have long been the cause and symbol of Greece's exposure to occupation, immigration, cultural hybridity. Since the founding of the modern Greek nation in 1832, defining a national identity has been characterized as a question or even as a problem. For this national identity, somehow needed to account for the weight and diversity of the nation's prehistory, including its ancient Roman, Byzantine, and Ottoman past, its continued multicultural intercultural reality, and European Enlightenment ideals of ethnic homogeneity. What ensued was an elaborate process or procedure of selective erasure, whereby Greek nationalism worked to advance a utopian ideal of cultural continuity and ethnic homogeneity from ancient to modern times. As Karakasitu notes, this was always tinged with racist undertones, as the transmission of Greek national culture was ascribed to biological reproduction and intertwined with suggestions of genetic purity. Efforts to silence minority histories and presence proliferated through structural and sonic violence, language, architecture, religion, music, policy. For much of modern Greek history, public discourse and policy have promoted predominantly organic understandings of national identity to the detriment of migrants and their descendants. For example, Greek citizenship law has historically been severely restrictive toward non-Greek immigrants and their descendants, who largely have remained indefinitely outside of the community of citizens. Conversely, it is markedly expansive toward ethnocultural Greeks living abroad. The homogenia, which translates literally to of the same genus or ancestry, and also as homogeneity. And these members of the homogenia retain their Greek citizenship and are even allowed to transmit it to their descendants who potentially have never set foot in Greece. Only in 2015 was a law passed that allowed children born in Greece to migrant parents to acquire citizenship. But still, the process is difficult and cumbersome, and many people, like Negros de Moria, simply opt out of the process. Non-Greek migrants to Greece and their descendants also face significant difficulties with assimilation and quality of life, including access to housing and healthcare, education and language acquisition, and opportunities to enter the workforce. The procedures even for obtaining a residence permit are complex and weighed down by bureaucracy, and many resort to living illegally and working in the black market. In recent years, there has been a marked increase in crime motivated by racism, xenophobia, and related intolerance, as well as a steady mainstreaming of elements of extremist ideology in both political and public discourse, due in part to the economic crisis, coupled with the increase of irregular migrants and asylum seekers from Syria, Afghanistan, and other war-torn nations. While the Greek Constitution and Greek legislation offer some legal protection for instances of discrimination and racism and prejudice, there's much work to be done to expand upon these laws and enhance their effectiveness. The notion of post-migration has recently gained traction amongst migration scholars focusing on Western Europe and the Mediterranean. It first came to prominence in Germany as post-migrantische through the work of Sherman Langhoff in the realm of theater arts, where it was used to critique and protest the exclusion of migrants and their descendants from contemporary mainstream art and culture. Since this time, the term post-migration has been used in diverse ways with varying degrees of activist intent. However, it generally signifies moving beyond binary ways of thinking about newcomers that emphasize difference and the need for assimilation and integration. In fact, the post-migrant perspective questions the very assumption that there ever existed a stable, sedentary national we group into which the other should be expected to integrate, suggesting instead that migration is an ongoing process that has irreversibly shaped Europe for centuries. In addition, post-migration studies have begun to move away from the victimization of newcomers and their subsequent generations, recognizing their active role in shaping their own lives is marked by multiple belongings and affiliations and varying levels of acceptance and rejection. As Yildiz notes in his discussion of Turkish migrants to Germany, post-migrancy should be understood not as a condition of separateness, but as a social situation where post-migrant distinctions are placed under erasure in an intersectional context. He notes that especially the youngest generation of descendants has begun to assemble what he calls hybridized life projects, in which they actively take part in constructing their lives marked by overlaps, marginal and in-between spaces, intersections, and simultaneous affiliations. This participation in hybridized life projects often takes an activist approach, including the production of rich counter-narratives to hegemonic discourse, what Parati calls talking back to master political narratives. These activists often frame the nation as a multiple and ambiguous space of post-migrant belonging, advocating for alternative forms of social solidarity, national and transnational belonging, and moving towards a space beyond the nation. It is in this context that I position the work of Negros Moria as post-migrant activism. But in his music, Negros seems to run against the grain, for he is not advocating for rupturing the binary order of self and other, or for a post-migrant destination beyond the nation. On the contrary, he proudly and almost chauvinistically celebrates the singularity of modern Greek culture and national identity. What is perhaps unique about his approach is what I have termed post-migrant internationalism, his engagement of traditional culture and history in a manner that places the post-migrant at the center of Greek national identity constructs. So let's turn now to Negros and his music to see just how he does this. Negros Moria, his given name is Kofi Armstrong, was born in 1991 in the economically depressed and multi-ethnic Athens suburb of Ambelotipi. A rising star of contemporary Greek hip-hop, he has released 6 albums, beginning with Mimi Pitaf P, the mixtape in 2003, and ending with compilation 2019. His 7th album, Tohu Kapsi, is about to drop at the end of this year. Negros' music aligns perhaps most closely with hip-hop, music with activist origins amongst African-American and Latinx youth in the South Bronx in the 1980s, but of course is now a transnational medium for youth resistance, for the reworking of local identities all over the world. Interestingly, Negros rejects genre delineation, opting for a perhaps more transnational approach, characterizing his output simply as music that incorporates influences as diverse as hip-hop, reggae, and rebecca. Issues of belonging, citizenship, and national identity have haunted Negros for all his life. Though he was born in Greece, was baptized Greek Orthodox, received his education in Greece, and identifies as being Greek, he's not a Greek citizen because his parents, who were born in Ghana, did not have the legal status of Greek residency upon his birth. Negros describes the negative effects of not having citizenship on so many areas of his life. Quote, I was born here, but I'm not a citizen, which makes me non-legal, which means I'm trapped. Without the appropriate documents, the legal status of residency or citizenship, even the most simple of tasks becomes impossible. Renting a house, copywriting my art, every single function of daily life becomes an uphill battle. In addition, growing up Black in Greece meant that racism and discrimination have always been everyday phenomena. Playground incidents as a child to feeling ostracized from many public spaces, like from the largely ethnically homogenous Greek Orthodox Church to traditional Greek music clubs, in addition to experiencing racial profiling by police on the streets of his own neighborhood. For Negros, his music is his activism. Music is my main weapon in combating and dealing with the racism I encounter. It's my machine gun, my shotgun, my knife. I don't have the power to be the next Malcolm, the next Martin Luther King. The only way I can protest, the only way I can be an activist is through my music, by using my rap to tell the truth. His performances are carefully choreographed into pointed critiques of contemporary Greek society, in which he rejects prejudice and racism and the exclusion of Greeks of color in dominant national identity paradigms. His primary weapon for doing so, I argue, is post-migrant nationalism, placing the post-migrant, usually himself, at the center of Greek national identity constructs. For example, in a recent interview with a Greek newspaper, Negros declared, quote, I want to show them, his audiences, that I'm not only Greek, I am Elinaras. It's a term that translates loosely to a proud Greek, but with clearly chauvinistic undertones. Negros does this in numerous ways. For example, he incorporates his extensive knowledge of Greek history and culture into his performances and puts his patriotism boldly and provocatively on display, engaged in a manner that is sure to call attention to the constructed nature of national identities. His very stage name, Negros de Moria, is a play on Olleros Moria. That is the moniker of his favorite figure in Greek history, Theodoros Kolokotronis, who was a celebrated Greek army general who fought in the War of Independence against the Ottoman Empire. What's more, Negros raps while carrying ogoloi, worry beads, a string of beads carried by Greek men, help pass the time. And unlike any other hip-hop artist I have seen, he has been known to appear on stage in traditional Greek dress, including saroucha shoes with woolen pom-poms, the Horataris leg garters, and fustanella, a pleated skirt worn by the country's presidential guard. For any Greek, seeing a man of African descent dressed in this way while singing hip-hop ruptures hegemonic images of national belonging. Negros places himself at the center of Greek national identity constructs in other ways as well. Unlike many of his colleagues, he raps solely in Greek and uses bygone Greek slang of the early 20th century, of which many contemporary Greeks have little knowledge or facility. Quote, we need to go back to our roots. If we want to use slang, we should use our own slang. There's no need to be American. We have our own slang, and it's a language much older and much richer than American slang. The slang he chooses, he learned largely from rebetiko, an urban popular music genre of the late 19th and early 20th century that serves as his greatest musical influence. For Negros, rebetiko is, quote, the original hip-hop. It's music that expresses the trials and tribulations of turn 20th century urban Greeks, who were also discriminated against, ostracized from mainstream society. Embracing this music, with its own fraught history of acceptance and rejection, is another way to reject the ethnic cleansing that underscores much contemporary nationalist discourse. In the final section of this paper, I will analyze briefly two representative songs. The first is Tohum Kaps, which translates literally as they have burned it, but figuratively as they have lost their minds. This song borrows the melody of a famous Rebetiko song, Caite en Escolio, a school has burned, composed by Costas Bezos in 1935. The original song features voice and guitar and is composed of popular couplets that discuss the loss to fire of significant Greek towns and neighborhoods and schools in history. So let's listen briefly so you can have a sense of the melody of this song serves as an ostinato counter melody in Negros' Topokapsi, over which he raps primarily about contemporary Greek MCs and Greeks in general, lamenting that they are all sellouts who believe themselves to be the real thing, but aren't. The lyrics lead us to understand that Negros is in fact the real thing, as does his use of Rebetiko. The accompanying music video enhances this message as well. We see Negros in a traditional cafe, a traditionally male space where primarily older Greek men gather to drink, play cards, backgammon, and discuss politics. The older men in the cafe, and Negros amongst them, are presented as tough, unsmiling, and manly, a representation of true old-school Greekness. The presence of a young Black man and his friends in this traditional space is unexpected and immediately brings to the fore questions of national identity, integration, and assimilation. It's important to note that in real life, Negros has never been to a Rebetiko club, even though this is his favorite musical style, because he fears that the color of his skin would be a deterrent. So let's watch just a minute of his music video of Portuguese. Describe to you what's happening. Like I turn again. Here again, well, it's all together, but that's all. You can see. Negros is even more explicit in his rejection of exclusionist and organic understandings of Greek citizenship in some of his other songs. His song As Primera, White Day, is perhaps his most emphatic statement against racism and a vivid call for reconfigured understandings of Greek and national belonging. As Primera is from his 2016 album, Nesto Oma. The title translates literally as White Day, but is an expression in Greek that translates loosely to catching a break. In this song, Negros asks Greece when he will catch a break from the everyday experiences of discrimination and racism. This song is not based on Rebetika. It begins with a polyphonic drum beat produced in studio, but that resembles perhaps a Ghanaian kalongo or djembe drum with their characteristic tones. The lyrics begin with a powerful statement. I am Greek, you are anti-Greek, if you want them, the police, to chase me and to ask for my ID. It goes on to mock those who deny the presence of Black people in Greece since ancient times. And finally, the song notes how white foreigners of all kinds are welcome to Greece as tourists. They party with Greeks and drink and have a good time. but the foreign girls, like the beautiful Italian Monica, prefer black men and want negros. The chorus of the song is explicit in its positioning of negros, a black Greek at the center of Greek national identity constructs. And I will read you the chorus now, and then we'll listen just for a minute. So this rap is for every African, but I also respect you and love you, Greece. I have gold, diamonds, because I'm African, but the islands and my people, I love Greece. Africans have rhythm, music from the African, sales with the African, first culture from the African, but you call me monkey or chocolate because I am black. When will you cut me a Greece? Then I would play it for you. It won't. I would sing it for you, but but really, the chorus, right, is a bold depiction of the kinds of discrimination and racism that Negros experiences, powerful enough to leave the listener a bit uncomfortable. And I imagine that is precisely the point. So to conclude briefly, in this paper, I suggested that the work of Greek hip-hop artist Negros de Montreal is best understood as a form of post-migrant counternationalism that engages Greek culture and history to place the post-migrant at the center of Greek national identity constructs. So for doing so, I understand Negros as a unique and revolutionary musician, and his work certainly belongs in the category of post-migrant talking back to master narratives. But the question remains whether his work truly promotes an alternative form of social solidarity, a world without bounded citizenry, a truly cosmopolitan world in which, as Henry Sidgwick noted a century ago, a state might maintain order over a particular territory, but would neither determine who is to inhabit this territory or restrict the enjoyment of its advantages to any particular portion of the human race. I'm not sure that Negros' music gives us the answer. Thank you. So much, yeah, very good.
So now it is my pleasure to welcome Professor Daniel de Silva. He is a colleague here from Rutgers University in New Brunswick in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. And he has a PhD in Latin American and Iberian cultures from Columbia University and a certificate in feminist scholarship from the Institute for the Study of Sexuality and Gender. His research centers voice, music, and queer performance in the study of gender, sexuality, race, and popular music in Luso-Afro-Brazilian cultures. He has a forthcoming book by the title of Trans Tesituras, Queer Repertoires and Black Diaspora in Lusophone Popular Music. And please join me in welcoming.
Thank you so much for the introduction. To the organizing committee, to Rutgers-Newark, thank you for having me. Fox from where I was born and raised in the underground, just over the tracks, but almost always a world away. I want to talk about music today, about a playlist that I've gathered over time that is from that other world, seemingly small, limited, and yet heard in unsettling ways. It begins with an unexpected voice in the song. It was to catch a rhythm, but I remember his voice foremost. I'm not sure when I first heard him, but certainly by way of friends and bandmates with better music taste than mine at the time. I remember thinking, is this a woman singing? No. And yet, it was so like the voices of women I had heard in Portuguese music played at home. It was the late 90s, and I had just heard the voice of Antonio Variações, the now revered as a Portuguese popular music and LGBTQ icon, who became a national superstar in the early 80s and succumbed to AIDS at the apex of his fame before the release of only his second album in 1984. I wanted to hear more and headed over to Tusha to scour the sometimes dusty, sometimes shrink-wrapped CDs in their bins. Tusha was a local Portuguese gift shop that sat midway up Ferry Street, the main artery of the Iron Belt. It's since closed, but just a quick Google, I found this on eBay. And this is a Cafe China set stamped with this logo. And this is all that I could find that remains of Tusha. At Tusha, you can find anything, however, from imported textiles to ceramics, knickknacks, books, magazines, and a motley assortment of music. In their impressively eclectic selection, I lucked upon a newly released CD of Antonio Variações' greatest hits. And I devoured it at home, in my car, alone, with friends, enthralled by the way his music blended new wave and post-punk rock with distinct registers of Portuguese popular and folk song. To me, his voice was a revelation. I heard it as provocatively homoerotic. Yes, yet it also felt entirely familiar. He sounded in timbre and tone strangely like home. In the album photos, magazine spreads, and in videos that circulated on the internet, which I also did, his bare torso, full beard and makeup, sensual imagery served up implicitly sexual lyrical themes. These things were another world entirely, more like the New York gay clubs and dive bars that I had only just started to visit. I spent a large part of my teen years and early 20s escaping what I experienced as the stifling limitation of a neighborhood bounded by railroad tracks and a very Portuguese way of life. Rarely would friends take a 20-minute train ride east to Manhattan. Hours were spent standing around Newark street corners at Portuguese restaurants, at Portuguese bars, at Portuguese social clubs. Everyone else seemed to shine, while I had grown out my hair, put on weight, and hoped I could hide my queerness behind glasses, my wit, and my voice. I loved to sing, and in Newark, there's always been music. I fell in with other talented musicians who quickly became friends. At some point, however, the desire for sexual fulfillment overwhelmed. I ditched the glasses, cut my hair, took a keen interest in glam rock, and decided if others wanted the comforts of home, I would make the journey on my own for a different life. At first, for a music scene beyond the metal and hardcore punk and rock bands that surrounded me, but mostly to be someone I felt I could not be in Newark, to be gay. I headed toward the tracks to go beyond my limits. To get there, however, I had to walk past the hospital where I was born, my former elementary school, the Portuguese Catholic Church where I had once been an altar boy, the same church where I had also been a Boy Scout and attended Sunday school. All that hard work put into my upbringing, all those judgmental students standing as sentinels as I headed past them toward the tracks to go somewhere gay to get to New York. Truthfully, I was not entirely at home in cool, gay New York, though I would spend a decade working in its independent music scene and trying to make a name for my own band of commuter rock stars, shameless self-promotion. We are technically on hiatus. We played grimy stages and art galleries from the Lower East Side to Brooklyn. I made many new friends and many exciting nights of music, sex, and catharsis. But as a first-generation Portuguese American working in the music business in Manhattan, the moments I spent surrounded by so many who had come from small-town USA to the big city to find themselves and did so successfully were for me punctuated by a sense of doubt. After all, I was already here and still lost. It was in the Ironbound that I had first tried to find my voice, and where I first heard him, Antonio Variações. For me, Variações was an opening, a way of being that more closely resonated with my own, a way into my identity and desires that did not require a complete rejection of home. He sang of gay cruising, hinted at BDSM fantasies, of desiring to be elsewhere, but also of the experience of being Portuguese. His voice was at once queer and familiar, out of place, and so distinctly rooted in a place I knew well. In critical reception, some say his vocal tessitura, or textures, echoed the shrill or evoked the shrill singing of women in the folkloric traditions of northern Portugal, his birthplace. It was a voice that for me I could not immediately place. It resonated with Newark, with New York, with gay bars, and with Portuguese social clubs. It was full of textures, of a tessitura that was dramatic, strident, feminine, floating from a jukebox in one of those stifling Portuguese bars, nestled into a mixed tape of a friend, playing on a pointless drive into the suburbs, and sitting there in a bin in Dusha, alongside music imports unavailable anywhere else, from Portugal, from Brazil, and other Portuguese-speaking places. For Variações, however, it was Fado, and Lisbon's dramatic urban song, and Amália Rodrigues, Fado's most celebrated diva, that he would claim as muse and motherland. For me, Amália Rodrigues had been the soundtrack of Saturday morning chores and of long hours in a crowded family sedan en route to other Portuguese-prone cities. Her voice moved me, the Fado melodies stayed with me, but they were not a vector of my queer sexuality. Rather, they felt like a heavy hand on me, holding me close to all the things Portuguese, pleading with me to stay. Variações' debut recording, however, suggests a different material and effective terrain for Fado. As a companion track to the synthesizers of his first single, Estou Além, he recorded Povo Clavas no Rio, a Fado originally sung by Amália Rodrigues. Appearing on Portuguese TV in 1982, he took the stage dressed in a white blazer over a white shirt, unbuttoned to show a peak of his chest, hands hugging the curves of his legs, and a black sash around his waist. As he sings, Variações and mustache and thick beard sensually whips his arms up around his head in a kind of dance, drawing attention to his body, his hair, and his face. The instrumental arrangement renders the Fado a brooding post-punk ballad with electric guitars, droning drums, deviating altogether from classic Fado. His voice, however, is faithful to the Fado's melody, and he sings with the same dramatic stylings that mark Amália's performances, if not with the same effort. He drags out the emotion of the song, takes the listener up in body and breath, turning them on, or turning them off, as was the case for music critic ElSaffar at the time of its release. In a review of the single, which was a big hit in Portugal, Santos declares tongue-in-cheek that Variações' reconfigured Fado is a serious contender for top prize in bad taste. He first praises the instrumentation, says that the song is backed by a well-thought-out formula, but disparages the vocals. The instrumental arrangement is bearable, the voice is not. More than a criticism of talent, the pithy complaint casts Variações' voice as an unbearable and indiscreet transgression. It is a criticism that Trindade Santos repeats in other reviews of Variações, pointing to his voice in song as insufferable. But in this particular critique, he betrays an aversion to Variações' voice as the unbearable voicing of the feminine repertoire of Fado, of voicing through Fado a queer identity and desire, not in lyrical content, but in the material resonances of his vocalizations, of his vibrating vocal cords, the heaving of his chest as he takes up Amália's song, the unbearably ambiguous trills of his tessitura, the unbearable iteration of Fado that had been hidden from me, obscured by normative conventions of gender and genre. I heard his voice as Fado, but I also heard it as sexual and as queer. I felt his tessitura as a thrilling shift in the sedimented cultural terrain. A decade before Variações recorded the Fado by Amália, however, the Brazilian gay music icon Ney Mato Grosso also chose to record one of Amália's Fados on his solo debut. Matudosu gained fame rapidly in the early 70s for his countertenor voice style, which on the binary cis-heteronormative codifications of Western music is the highest male voice type overlapping with the female soprano. In his version of a fado, he recreates the drama of Amalia's vocalizations as outright sobs and weeping, letting the music fade out and leave us only with his soft cries for a prolonged ending. His intense performance prompted noted Brazilian music critic and historian José Ramos Tinhirão to write, "Nay remained crying just like a little woman." That little woman, mulherzinha in Portuguese, is a pejorative used to describe a vulgar, excessive, and off-putting performance of femininity, and also to cast aspersions at an effeminate man. For the entirety of the song, Matudoso had been singing as a woman, saying the gendered grammar of the lyrics of the fado without any modifications. Tinhirão, however, takes issue directly with the dramatic sobs and uses mulherzinha, little woman, to suggest that Matudoso's voice is implicitly false. What do we hear when we hear gender transgressive voices in song? How do we perceive gender transgressive performances? In what context? Through what codifications of voice, gender, and genre? The genealogy of gender transgressive voice in popular Lusophone music I've traced back from Variações to Matudoso has its contemporary iterations, and these questions were surprisingly taken up by Brazilian media outlet Estado de Minas in 2018 when it gathered a panel of specialists to judge whether or not Brazilian drag queen and popular music sensation Pablo Vittar sings well, sings with her true voice, if she is singing at all. It's a good time to mention that Pablo Vittar is the most famous drag queen in the world, with over 1.8 billion views, 7.4 million subscribers on YouTube, and receives over 6 million monthly listeners on Spotify alone. She is the first drag queen to be nominated for a Grammy, to win an MTV Europe Music Award for Best Brazilian Act. Vittar has released 3 full-length albums, singing in several languages and featuring high-profile international collaborations. She's featured on Lady Gaga's Dawn of Chromatica, has been the face of a Coca-Cola ad campaign, and the voice of Gold Diva, an international superhero and pop star drag queen inspired by Vittar on Netflix's pioneering Brazilian animated series Super Drags. Indeed, while her drag style is bold, sexual, feminine, it's her voice that is her most recognizable attribute. Vittar, who presents as queer femme and identifies as a gender non-conforming, quote, gay boy who does drag, is also a countertenor, defined in music theory as a male high voice with an abnormally ultralight high range, with no apparent register change, able to maintain an unusually high tessitura. For countertenors, then, a very high tessitura is the most characteristic attribute of their voice. Yet, while Vittar's tessitura has been heard many times over, there are ways in which she remains unintelligible. And while countertenors may find their voices comfortably transgressed, the gendered ranges of voice type, critical descriptors betray the compulsory cis-heterosexist paradigms through which these voices are heard with unsettling effects. These are just some comments from the experts that they gathered in print on what they hear when they hear Vittar singing. Insists a lot, squeaky, high-pitched, very bad, she's screaming, sings the wrong way. It's interesting. It raises discussion. It's different. It's not new. Breaks with convention. Could be better. With a lot of training, could be less. Despite their commercial success, telling critiques reveal how these artists may be misheard, rendered unintelligible. I call these textures, these tessituras of gender transgressive voice and performance, trans tessituras, textures of voice that move across sites of contestation, where cultural anxieties over gendered conventions of voice and body play out. Trans tessituras are heard as gender transgressions in vocalizations, embodied in performance, and telling in their reverberations against the normative codifications of gender and genre. They may sound out from bodies in ways that prove unstable, may be perceived as confounding, suffer policing, heard as false, said to require disciplining, judged as harmful, described as unpleasant or unrefined, or heard in ways not wholly intended. In their confounding reception, trans residues are made unintelligible or recognized as expressions that are nevertheless hegemonically defined. Importantly, though, trans residues also serve as analytics that expose the limits and excesses of discourses that have given form and meaning to homo and transphobic, misogynist, and racist repertoires of performance subjectivity. In Lusophone context, these discourses permeate a vast transatlantic terrain where their affective exposition move across gender discourses of sex, song, and nation as a mode of resistance against dissonance and incoherence and toward other registers, gathering resonances through which they may be known. Consider Afro-Brazilian artist and self-identified Bicha Travesti, Linda Quebrada, who most recently was a contestant on Brazil's Big Brother. Notably, she announced the release of her first full-length album, Bashiba, in 2017, with an Instagram post to fans asking them if they were ready for her version of Lemonade. A trans version of Lemonade, referencing Beyonce's critically acclaimed album, Lemonade. Famously, Beyonce's album was received with overwhelming popular appeal and some controversy, launching a national dialogue and university courses on its intervention in U.S. history and representations of a particularly Southern Black U.S. culture, of Black feminism and Black queer subjectivities. Clearly, Quebrada sees her own work in resonance with Beyonce's album, but have we heard it as such? Where are the courses? There's one at Rutgers in Brunswick. Shameless self-image. As the study of Afro-Brazilian cultures and histories responded to Quebrada's call to drink her music up as a distinct Brazilian trans lemonade, Quebrada is not an anomaly. Rather, she joins a litany of Luso-Afro-Brazilian queer, trans, and travesti artists who are making music that represents, critiques, and intervenes in particular histories and identities. They sound out in unsettling ways, in ways unexpected, resonating as a material ground upon which those for whom they register may gather. Moving beyond normative and national demarcations, trans destitutas in Luso, Afro-Brazilian contexts are also transatlantic, from the Afro-Brazilian roots of Fado to Portuguese and Brazilian queer, trans, and travesti performers of today and decades past, to Luso Americans living in Newark, Iowa. Take as one example the contemporary collaborations of Pablo Vidal, an Angolan performer, and trans woman, Titica. Sorry, this is indicated other. And this is Pablo Vidal and Titica. She too insists on her repertoire is larger than the Angolan post-colonial aesthetics that surround her, and claims kinship and resonance, just as Linda Quebrada does, with Black and queer artists' subjectivities beyond the linguistic, nationalist, normative divide. This is a playlist. It is evidence of a decentered and queer Luso-Afro-Brazilian diaspora, untethered exclusively to Luso-Afro-Brazilian repertoires, cultural practices, or histories, while rooted and grounded through so much of that terrain. They have been for me a playlist of support, possibility, fascination, and queer potentiality of Luso-Afro-Brazilian diasporas that may no longer only reside in dusty music bins at Dusha, but that can be heard in the bars and clubs in the Ironbound, in New York, in Lisbon, in São Paulo, in Rwanda, and London, amongst many other places. They are shared and broadcast now in viral, social, and mass media, and reverberate with mutual recognition of one another. Importantly, they broadcast vast, dynamic Luso-Afro-Brazilian subjectivities, intimately affecting how we may identify come to terms with and refigure lines with demarcation, migration, diaspora, and the tracks that bind us into so many constellations, into lines of movement, into tracks that find us, and registers in which we are recognized and desired as a strategy of kinship. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Daniel. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Amir ElSaffar, composer, trumpeter, oud player, and vocalist Amir ElSaffar has been described by The Wire as, quote, uniquely poised to reconcile jazz and Arabic music, unquote, and by the Chicago Tribune as one of the most promising figures in jazz today. A recipient of the Doris Duke Performing Artist Award, a U.S. Artist Fellowship, and a Hodder Fellowship at Princeton University, ElSaffar is an expert trumpeter with a classical background, conversant not only in the language of contemporary jazz, but has created techniques to play microtones and ornaments idiomatic to Arabic music that are not typically heard on the trumpet. Additionally, he is a purveyor of the centuries-old, now endangered Iraqi maqam tradition, which he performs actively as a vocalist and oud player. As a composer, ElSaffar has used the subtle microtones found in Iraqi maqam music to create an innovative approach to harmony and melody. He has released half a dozen albums and has toured internationally. And I want to welcome Amir ElSaffar.
Thank you very much for the kind reading of my bio. Thanks to the two presenters. This is very, very inspiring. Super happy to be part of this panel today and to share some organize this wonderful. I'm not an academic. It's just something mostly about my own experiences as a practicing musician and some of the theoretical ideas that emerged throughout my practice. I don't have a PowerPoint, but I will thanks to all of the performance at the end of my talk. So, and of course, my ensemble, Two Rivers, will be performing at ODR. So as you heard a little bit from my bio, I perform I'm a jazz trumpet player. I also perform traditional Iraqi maqam music, and I'm also classically trained. Worked in Chicago, studying the Chicago Symphony, and pretty rigorous background in that before I integrated myself. But just I think to kind of describe where the kind of approach that I've developed, a little bit of autobiographical information is necessary. So I'm born in Chicago, 1977. My father was an Iraqi immigrant. He came in the 60s. He was a physicist who taught at DePaul University. And my mother was the 12th generation. It was family went back to Cambridge, and she was an academic. She was a Spanish literature professor at Cervantista. So she was one of the first Cervantist scholars who was not a native Spanish speaker. And so growing up, the child of two academics, kind of maybe the way I think about my own work, even though it's outside of academia. But also gave me kind of a rich array of cultural influences growing up. So Spanish and Arabic were spoken in my house as much as English. Certainly when my mother was hosting scholars. father's cousins and family members. We grew up mostly speaking English, but I learned Arabic in the 20s. So, and currently speak it somewhat fluently. But my musical background started when I was 9 years old. When I first heard the Beatles, I had to learn how to play every single one of their songs. So I picked up the ukulele because it was the only instrument we had sitting around and learning the basics of 1, 4, 5 chords. And learned quite a bit of the orchestra. Eventually I moved to the guitar. And then to the electric guitar and started writing those songs. My most prolific era was between the ages of 11 and 14. I think I wrote a song every other day. I was in love with this girl who was sitting on the other side of the house, but she liked somebody else. And my understanding of music theory, I don't know if any of you know the cycle of Fitz, but it's like a sort of where music theories all kind of comes down to when chord resolves to the next and resolves to the next. G resolves to C, C resolves to F. Well, I understood at a young age that G really liked C a lot, was naturally on C, and C kind of looked over G and was like, well, you're okay, but and it was just this endless cycle, and sort of at 11 years old, I was like, okay, so that's why. So to kind of make sense of why I was in so much despair. And I wrote a lot of songs, and I still remember a few of them performing them since then. Around 13, so I was born in 77, so in 1990, the same year that my parents were divorcing, Iraq and Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and suddenly Iraq was all over the news every single day, and it was becoming quickly apparent that the US was going to wage a war. Suddenly, I became aware that I wasn't just from some part of the country that had nothing to do with contemporary life, but actually that country was the subject of everyday conversation. I was becoming ostracized at school and looked upon as something different, and suddenly I wasn't just, the kid with a funny name, but actually had a lot of negative associations. And at the same period, so my parents were divorcing, then my father was sick, Guillain-Barré, and the immune system attacked the nervous system. He went completely paralyzed for an entire year. And I think that I probably at 13 years old would have found a very negative outlet for all the emotions I was experiencing. Fortunately, I had an electric guitar in my hands. I had just discovered Jimi Hendrix and Led Zeppelin. So I had a 3-piece rock band, and we were making songs and recording every weekend on very kind of rough and angsty music that was really an expression of, for me, was what I was going through personally. And I was, in my school life, I was ditching school and going to protests in Chicago and really actively trying to understand suddenly who I was in this dramatically difficult and different context than anything I've experienced before. And it was an ongoing process. I'm just going to continue, but in my mid-teens, by like 14, 15 years old, I discovered the trumpet, and I started to find a lot of, well, I should say there was an intermediate step, which is the blues. And my father, who was an Iraqi immigrant, the only music that he felt spoke to him, that spoke to his soul, in this new environment, was the blues. And he would take us kids to the blues clubs on the south side. So when I was 13, my sister painted a mustache on the face so that I would look like I was 21. I didn't look, I still have a photograph. I don't look 21. But I really cared. We were all one. We stayed till 4 a.m. Saturday night. It felt like the beginning of a church. It's incredible, wonderful environment. And I went deeper and deeper into the blues until I just heard Muddy Waters and Robert Johnson, and then started understanding the other side of it, which was the jazz tradition, in particular Miles Davis, but others who had strong blues underpinning to their. So I got through the rest of my teens by playing jazz and also training in classical music. And find that the African American expression, improvisation, the freedom, and the emphasis on rhythm, and the sort of possibility for ecstatic expression in music was something that I was very attracted to. And that was by, throughout my high school and then my college years, I started gigging all over Chicago with blues bands, jazz bands, reggae, salsa. I was playing 6 months a week while maintaining this life as a classical, a secret double life. So I'd be at the club till 3 a.m. Playing salsa, and then at 10 a.m. I'd be, dressed in a tuxedo and ready to play Brooklyn or Harlem in the basement. And nobody could know that it was in their world that I lived. If they did, or my teachers would have. So right after finishing school, I moved to New York, and I found that in New York City there was a lot of other possibilities. And basically, there were a few musicians that I encountered early on who were engaging with non-Western musical forms of their background. Indian, some were coming from different parts of Africa, Latin, South America, and were finding new ways to connect with jazz, and not in a very surface way, but in a deeply engaged way. And that was when I first had the first inkling to go to Iraq studying Maqam, which is the traditional music form that has been practiced for centuries. And so first I was singing, and then I was learning how to do the santur, which is the English. And just on the eve of when I decided to, go on this journey, 9/11. And so then suddenly, again, I became not only the object of students and classmates, but now I was law enforcement authorities. And so flying suddenly became very difficult. I was always pulled aside. Questions decided that sport that I, was thinking about all definitions. I was definitely receiving extra attention during that time. And I was also undeterred in my persistence. And I just knew that this was the one chance to go to Iraq, because it was very apparent the war would become the same before who knows what the future would hold for Iraq. So 2002, I spent about 6 months in Iraq. And that was my first exposure, and it was really like a homecoming where I found a whole community of musicians and singers and connoisseurs and experts who were taking part in this centuries-old musical form that suddenly I felt something resonating in my soul that connected very deeply and a very something I've never felt before. It was kind of like when I loved about Muddy Waters, and I loved about Miles Davis, I loved about the Beatles and art, and all these influences that I experienced up until then were kind of all coalesced in the singing and the music of Baghdad. And that trip was originally supposed to be 6 months in home, but it extended to about 5 years. I had to leave Iraq because the invasion was happening a year later, but I was able to travel throughout the Arab world and eventually to Europe, where I met my main teacher, Hamid Salati, who was really my guru and my guide in learning all the fine details of this tradition. And mostly I was singing at the time, not playing with trumpet. And concurrently in this era, I was also working with Cecil Taylor's large ensembles. Cecil Taylor is the person who defined the free jazz. He and Ornette Coleman defined the free jazz movement in the 50s and 60s. So I again had a double life, but this time between the old tradition of the maqam from Iraq and very, very contemporary sounds of Cecil Taylor. And that was very enriching and kind of gave me a sense of how I might start to create my own musical sound and finding a musical voice that would somehow embody all these elements and not have to restrict ourselves to just being in one trying to find something more non-binary, free to all the influences. And so in 2006, I came back to the United States and received my first commission and composed Two Rivers. And that was the birth of my Two Rivers ensemble, which you're going to hear tonight, a version of. And Two Rivers is a sextet, and basically the origin of this group was to fuse the elements of maqam, the arabi, and all these very intricate melodies with jazz improvisation and orchestration, the kind of approach and freedom from the contemporary jazz music. And at the beginning, I think the elements were very clear where the maqam began and where the jazz began, and the borders. I think there was a little bit of crossover, but the elements were still separate in terms of the choice of musicians, in terms of organization. But over the past 15 years, that group has coalesced into something that is sort of unclear what we're playing. Is it coming from Middle Eastern, Arabic, Iraqi, Maqam language, or is it coming from jazz? It's sort of becoming more and more. And now that group is extended to the 17-piece Rivers of Sound Orchestra. So it just came out to where Europe. So this 17-piece ensemble is taking these ideas and expanding them to a much wider orchestral component. For even more kind of exponentially possibilities in terms of education. I just want to mention Muhammad Saadi, who's the main teacher. For years and years, I was trying to find a way to bring him to the States. In 2017, I became aware of the Artist Protection Fund fellowship, which is kind of like Scholars at Risk, but specifically for artists. And we applied and were approved for funding. And so I brought Hamid in 2018 to the United States, but we needed an academic sponsor, host institution, to in order to make this grant possible. And it was a phone conversation I had with Tim Raphael in late 2018 that led to Rutgers-Newark becoming the host institution for this great, the only living Iraqi Muslim singer and scholar. So I feel forever indebted to Rutgers-Newark as well as Tim for taking on this incredible role, and then Hamid's successive lectures at the Dana Library, performances that come this place. And he's currently teaching at Sarah Lawrence College. It's a weekly class in architecture. So it's been this continuous. He's basically the welcome to the United States, and we've been performing quite regularly. He's now part of the Two Rivers Ensemble. So just a few minutes left, and I just want to talk about what approaches or what questions I have to ask myself, because world music fusion is a very problematic genre. It goes back, in some ways you could say hundreds of years, but at least in the music industry since the 1990s. The model was often, a Western artist backed by millions of dollars from a record company would go to an impoverished nation and record people, or organize some recording session and get the voices and rhythms of different parts of the world and pay them very small amounts of money, and then take these recordings and sell them on the mass market. Incredible profits from them, which the original artists would never see. So there's a certain form of extractivism, exploitation that has been involved in world music. And it's not just that the struggle, you can hear it in the sound. It's not only this is happening in all sounds, but if you pay attention, why is this didgeridoo connecting with that tabla, and why this rhythm from how did they wind up together? And there's often a naivete on the part of the producers because they don't understand what they're engaging. And so in the early 2000s, I was very conscious of these things, structurally, economically, but also musically. And it was important to me that whatever I produced didn't sound like, or didn't engage in that way. So it was a big dilemma for me, and I was it was an identity crisis in some ways, but also me trying to be clear about what was combining with what, and whether these were compatible musical forms. And so after months and months of soul searching, I kept breaking down the forms to their component parts and going down further and further until I kind of reached the DNA of one Makan melody and one jazz rhythm, one Makan rhythm and one jazz chord, and started to find these interstitial spaces in which they actually do carry the same resonance. And so it was a whole research that I did, partly experientially, but through performing, through listening, through playing with other people, before I even set the first step in trying to combine these musical traditions, because I'm very sensitive and aware of what these languages mean in their own contexts. And, the cultural code of one melody that the audience immediately recognizes that brings them to a certain geographical place or a certain kind of experience or a certain emotion. And if you just take that and present it in an unconscious manner, it might not be received the same way. So how do we mitigate kind of a form of translation, but also a form of setting the context for each melody, for each phrase to exist in this possible way. And as that process has gone further and further, like I was saying earlier, the differences become negligible, and there's sort of this fluid space in which it's no longer clear where one tradition ends and where one musical language begins. And similarly in the Rivers of Sound ensemble, this is an orchestra now with 17 people. And typically the model for an orchestra is you have the composer, conductor, and then musicians that all have scores and do what they're told. I don't like that model. I'm looking for something that's non-hierarchical. I've chosen wonderful musicians who are great improvisers, whom I'm humbled by what they can do and want them to express themselves through their hands. So these musicians are coming from Arabic backgrounds, also Indian backgrounds, Taiwanese, and jazz musicians with a wide array of influences. And my interest is in finding a space where each person can express themselves and be completely free and be part of the process, as opposed to just taking orders or doing exactly as what the score says, what they're told to do. And sometimes it can be a chaotic process, but I welcome that. Sometimes some sound checks sound like a complete catastrophe. But the first time we performed together was 2 hours before we were rehearsing and we're Lincoln Center atrium, and the public was about to enter. And I thought, okay, it was a great experiment, didn't work this time. You know what? Keep trying. And then once the lights came on, we were on stage, something magic happened. I can't explain what it was, what the difference between 5:30 p.m. and 7:30 p.m. something happened. But more importantly, the musicians brought all of their energy, all of their attention, all of their dedication and commitment to the sound. And so in the end, what we have is a community of people, human beings, that are not representative of one musical language or one nation. Nations don't exist anymore. Or even a tradition, and I've been using the word tradition a few times. I think we need to maybe start removing that word from our vocabulary, because again, tradition, a lot of these traditions are 100 years old, but we think they're ancient. And tradition and contemporaneity are often seen as mutually exclusive. But a tradition or a contemporaneous sound is anything that's being made today. So if I sing thousands of year old melody right now, it's a contemporary sound. It's not any different from somebody who's composer. And we often say tradition about non-Western cultures, and we don't say tradition about, like, we don't call Bach traditional music very often. So just a quick little slide. But the goal is to kind of go beyond all of these notions that are sort of deeply fixed in our minds, and without trying to tackle them directly, but to immediately present an alternative model. And so the last piece that we did for Rivers of Sound consists of the musicians in the hall surrounding the audience in this immersive experience. And the musicians are listening to each other, the audience is hearing the resonances, and it's not clear who's playing what part, what language, or what tradition is being represented, and yet we're collectively involved in this performance together. So I'm going to end with a short little piece and a little teaser for what's to come.
So wonderful. Please all come tonight and listen to Amir ElSaffar. I want to introduce our last speaker. Alexandra is a very good friend and neighbor. And she is an associate professor in the Department of Performance Studies at New York University. She is the author of The Florida Blues, University Press 2022, and Listening in Detail, Performances of Cuban Music, which was published